North Korea has fired an intercontinental ballistic missile or ICBM into waters near Japan after threatening the United States. The long-range missile flew for more than an hour before landing short of Japanese waters. Pyongyang's launch comes just after it threatened retaliation against what it says were recent US spy plane incursions over its territory. Earlier this week, it threatened to shoot down such planes. However, Washington has dismissed this accusation and says its military patrols are in line with international law. This comes during a period of heightened tensions on the peninsula as Washington and Seoul are ramping up their defense cooperation. It also appears timed to coincide with the NATO summit in Lithuania, where leaders from South Korea, Japan and the United States are meeting to discuss security issues, including the threat posed by North Korea. South Korean and US officials met immediately after this launch, issuing a statement reiterating their quote-unquote strengthened joint defense. Now, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol also convened an emergency meeting of his National Security Council from Lithuania. Security concerns have ramped up on the peninsula this year after North Korea tested new weapons. The country also conducted a record number of missile launches last year in 2022. These missile launches included the ones that were capable of reaching even US territory. In response, the US and South Korea have increased their joint military drills around the peninsula.
It is estimated that the ballistic missile flew for about 74 minutes and fell into the Sea of Japan, about 250 kilometers west of Hokkaido's Okushiri Island at around 11:13 a.m.
North Korea conducted a missile test with its longest ever flight time on Wednesday. The missile flew for 74 minutes and just over 600 miles before falling into the sea, around 150 miles west of Japan's Hokkaido. That's according to Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Hirokazu Matsuno, who strongly condemned the launch.
North Korea's series of actions, including its repeated ballistic missile launches, threaten the peace and security of Japan's region and the international community and are absolutely unacceptable. Moreover, such ballistic missile launches violate relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions and are a serious security issue for our citizens. We've lodged a strong protest against North Korea through our embassy in Beijing.
Hirokazu said Japan believes the rocket was an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. The North test-fired its first ever solid-fuel ICBM in April. Analysts believe they can fly far enough to strike targets anywhere in the United States, and that the country has likely developed nuclear warheads that can fit on rockets. The launch follows heated complaints by the North in recent days, including accusing American spy planes of violating its airspace, and comes ahead of an expected Wednesday meeting between leaders of South Korea and Japan at a NATO summit to discuss threats, including the nuclear-armed North.
All right, Elizabeth Beavers, who's the VP of Public Affairs at Quincy Institute, is joining me live. Welcome to you, Elizabeth, for joining in. Let's begin by first discussing the timing of this missile. The NATO summit is on. South Korea and Japan have, of course, vowed to use this summit to call for strong international solidarity to confront such threats. How do you see this going on in terms of timing?
Sure, you're exactly right. Right now at the NATO summit, the US, South Korea, and allies are talking about increasing even further pressure on North Korea. So it's not surprising that they would send a message at this particular moment. And in fact, it is not at all surprising, even though it is very disturbing. Look, we know exactly why North Korea is doing this because North Korea has told us multiple times why they do things like this. They have said they will match power for power, goodwill for goodwill, and this is only the latest in a cycle of tit for tat, escalation, retaliation between the United States, South Korea, and North Korea over what North Korea perceives as hostile, aggressive actions from the United States and South Korea, and says it is acting in deterrence. So certainly the United States government doesn't have to agree with that or like it, but we would be foolish to ignore it.
All right, US has said that it would take all necessary measures to ensure its security, and not just its own, but that of South Korea and Japan as well. Has North's firing of the ICBM, not only this time, but in the past too, which now has become a regular phenomenon, only strengthened the US resolve?
Well, we've certainly seen the United States continue to double down on what candidly is a failed strategy. More pressure is going to be met with further pressure from North Korea. And again, that cycle just continues. You know, it's really interesting when we look back at what history shows us. There is an inverse correlation between the status of US and North Korea diplomacy and the relationship and this kind of arms race and these sort of provocative actions that we're seeing. You know, when the United States and North Korea were talking, North Korea self-imposed a moratorium on long-range ballistic missiles and nuclear testing. They even destroyed a nuclear test site. But as the relationship has deteriorated, we're seeing North Korean leaders continue to issue threats, demonstrate weapons capability, warn that they see themselves as a nuclear state. They're prepared to use that in deterrence, as they say. So certainly, you know, I unfortunately do expect continued doubling down on just continuing this cycle. But what we really need is a different course of action, a reset in the relationship. That's the only thing that's going to break this cycle.
All right. Now, let's also talk about the pattern. Foreign policy experts have been talking about this pattern to Pyongyang, where it is inflating external threats to only rally domestic support and justify weapons tests. What do you make of this pattern of inflating this kind of external threats? In this case, of course, we've seen it coming from the United States, going by what Pyongyang has to claim.
Sure, it's totally predictable. We see it over and over and over. And you know what? I don't think we can ignore that 70 years ago this month, the Korean War itself paused with a really fragile armistice that was meant to be replaced with a durable peace agreement and never was. So we're still living 70 years later, ostensibly in a state of war, in a really peculiar circumstance in which there's certainly not peace, but not quite full-blown armed conflict. And it could certainly lead towards the latter, but we would like it to go towards the former. So, you know, as long as this underlying conflict is unresolved and the pressure for pressure keeps mounting, we're going to continue to see exactly this, and we should expect to see exactly this. You know, the Biden administration, I think, has an opportunity to break the cycle. We could commemorate the 70-year anniversary by working to declare an end to the Korean War, by finding those incremental ways to warm up the relationship and actually change our posture towards North Korea instead of, you know, at best ignoring them and at worst potentially escalating to where things could get violent. We certainly don't want that. I think the Biden administration can change course, but if they don't, we should expect to just continue to see these same results over and over.
Elizabeth, that question, you know, you've made a very valid point. That question does seem to cross our mind. Why isn't the Biden administration choosing to de-escalate the situation? Because they not only, remember, have the war in Ukraine to tackle, they also have tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Why have a North Korea above their heads?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's so much status quo in U.S. foreign policy. There's almost sort of like a fear to deteriorate from what we've been doing. It was very controversial when President Trump spoke with Kim Jong-un directly back when he was president. But that was doing the right thing. He was doing the right thing to talk. What he didn't do then was follow up with policy changes that actually changed the course of the relationship. Look, we have a travel ban on Americans going to North Korea. We have an incredible sanctions regime that is contributing to a humanitarian problem. We have Korean War families who are still waiting to receive their loved ones' remains from the war. We have separated families across North and South Korea. We could be facilitating those reunions. There are so many things we could be doing here that would get us a step closer to real peace and real diplomacy. So I think the Biden administration can do it. It just requires the political will.
All right, Elizabeth, I think you broke down all those details very eloquently for us. Many thanks to you for joining in and sharing your precious time with us.